England in the early Middle Ages appeared to many as a land defined by slow rhythms and familiar patterns. Local kings ruled over modest territories, monasteries preserved learning, rural life revolved around seasons more than politics. For most people, danger came from neighboring lords, border quarrels, or small feuds that rarely threatened the entire island. And yet, beneath this surface of apparent continuity, England was far more fragile than it seemed. Its kingdoms were independent of one another. Its rulers often acted in isolation. Its defenses assumed that danger would always announce itself long before it arrived. That assumption collapsed the moment Viking sails appeared on the horizon. At first, those who saw them believed they were witnessing another coastal raid. Disruptive, perhaps violent, but temporary. The truth revealed itself with devastating speed. What followed was not an ordinary attack, but a coordinated assault that tore through some of the most revered places in the land. Monasteries that had preserved knowledge for centuries were burned. Kingdoms that had ruled proudly for generations faltered almost instantly. Alliances that had survived civil wars and political crises shattered in the face of a threat no one had prepared for. And at the center of the storm, Alfred of Wessex found himself confronting the unimaginable, the potential extinction of his lineage, his people, and his kingdom. Forced into hiding with only a small band of loyal followers, he would have to fight not only invading armies, but the collapse of trust, unity, and hope within his own realm. This is the story of the war that remade England, a conflict born in fire and betrayal, shaped by political fracture and resolved through resilience, strategy, and the unlikeliest survival. For generations, the sea had not been viewed as a highway for invading armies. England's dangers traditionally came from within: rival dynasties, disputed borders, ambitious warlords. The coast was a place of trade, fishing, and monastic travel. But on a quiet morning along the northeastern shore, observers reported a sight that felt entirely new: a dark smear on the horizon that slowly widened. As the shape grew, fishermen recognized it first. Long, narrow hulls cut through the waves with unnatural speed, moving in tight formation. Shepherds on distant bluffs saw the red-striped sails catching the morning light. Monks paused outside stone chapels, unsure whether what they were witnessing was natural or ominous. And then the truth became clear. These were Viking ships, dozens of them, approaching with purpose. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a primary source for this era, later summarized the moment in a single line: "The heathen men came with great force." The simplicity of that sentence captures the shock felt by those who saw the fleet close in. These were not scattered raiders. Their formation was disciplined, their timing precise, and their approach swift. Lindisfarne, a monastic center of immense cultural importance, was struck with terrifying efficiency. The monks, unarmed and unprepared, had no chance. The attackers knew where the sacred objects were kept. Reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts, jeweled chalices, all were seized before fire consumed the wooden structures. Survivors described warriors moving with clear coordination, not random violence. They were not stealing at random. They were executing a plan. And the devastation did not end there. Jarrow, Wearmouth, Repton, and Medway suffered similar fates. These attacks came faster than news could spread. Some regions received reports only after their own settlements had already been overrun. Nothing in England's earlier experience resembled this pace. This was not opportunistic plunder. These were reconnaissance-driven assaults meant to test defenses, gather intelligence, and identify weaknesses. The psychological impact was immense. People who had lived their entire lives without seeing large-scale foreign warfare now faced a threat that seemed to rise from the sea itself. Kings convened emergency councils. Priests proclaimed days of fasting and penitence. Nobles ordered rapid fortifications of estates. But these reactions were disconnected and local. No unified plan existed. England's kingdoms had never needed one. What those living through this moment could not yet understand was that the Viking raids of the late 8th and early 9th centuries were only the first ripples of a far larger storm. A force unlike anything England had seen was preparing to descend upon the island, and the day the sky turned black was merely the beginning. To many Saxons, early Viking raids seemed chaotic. Explosions of violence driven by hunger or greed. But this interpretation underestimated the profound social and political changes underway in Scandinavia. By the mid-9th century, demographic pressures, shifting inheritance customs, and emerging power centers had created a generation of ambitious war leaders. Younger sons without land sought fortunes abroad. Exiled chieftains looked for followers. Skilled fighters trained in local conflicts were eager to test themselves in foreign lands. Most importantly, these leaders recognized that cooperation brought enormous advantages. For years, raiding parties had operated independently. But through travel, trade, and conflict, Scandinavian warbands began exchanging knowledge. They learned which English monasteries held wealth, which river routes allowed deep inland travel, and which kingdoms were most vulnerable. Gradually, alliances formed. Beginning in the 800s and 50s, reports increased of larger fleets, winter settlements, and joint operations among Viking factions. Their strategies evolved. Instead of launching quick hits and fleeing, they began overwintering in England, using fortified encampments as bases for multi-year campaigns. This was a radical departure from earlier patterns. It meant they could coordinate attacks, distribute spoils, and maintain pressure on multiple fronts. By 865, several powerful chieftains united their followers into what English sources would call the Great Heathen Army. Names associated with this coalition, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubba, appear in both sagas and chronicles. While the sagas embellish their stories, contemporary evidence confirms that these figures commanded significant respect and military capability. The chronicle noted with alarm, and they took winter quarters here. That sentence signaled that England now faced something unprecedented, a standing invading army capable of long-term occupation. While Saxon kings debated among themselves, the Great Heathen Army studied England with the clarity of an outside observer. They saw exactly what made the island vulnerable. Each kingdom had its own royal line, its own priorities, and its own rivalries. Northumbria distrusted Mercia. Mercia maneuvered against Wessex. East Anglia often sought the protection of whichever neighbor threatened it least. Instead of a united front, the Vikings encountered 4 isolated kingdoms, each strong enough to defend itself for a time, but none strong enough to defend the whole island. The Great Heathen Army did not simply exploit English weakness. It understood English politics better than many of England's rulers, and it moved with a speed and cohesion that the Saxon kingdoms were unprepared to match. By the time the scale of the invasion became clear, the Great Heathen Army was already marching across the land. The invasion began with Northumbria, a once powerful kingdom weakened by internal strife. Rival kings Osbert and Ella had fought bitterly for control. Their feud had divided the nobility and shattered administrative cohesion. When the Vikings seized York, one of Northumbria's most important cities, the two kings attempted a hasty reconciliation and launched a joint counterattack. It failed catastrophically. Both kings were killed. The chronicle recorded their deaths without lamentation, noting simply the overthrow of the kingdom. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler, effectively dissolving Northumbria as an independent political force. East Anglia was next. King Edmund attempted negotiation, granting horses to the invaders in exchange for their temporary departure. But when they returned with larger forces, Edmund refused to renounce his rule or his faith. He was captured and killed. Later, hagiographies dramatized his martyrdom, but even the earliest accounts agree that his refusal to submit sealed his fate. Mercia followed, not through a single decisive battle, but through political disintegration. King Burgred, facing pressure both from Viking forces and from internal opposition, fled to Rome. The invaders installed Ceolwulf II as their preferred ruler. The chronicle describes him with thinly veiled disdain, a foolish king's thing. In the eyes of contemporaries, he held power only because the Vikings allowed it. In less than a decade, 3 kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, had collapsed. Only Wessex remained independent, and even it was strained to its limits. Refugees from across the island poured into its territory, bringing stories of lost battles, destroyed towns, and widespread betrayal. Wessex, the last surviving kingdom, now faced the full weight of Viking ambition. As the Great Heathen Army advanced, England's internal bonds frayed. The Vikings understood that fear could undermine resistance as effectively as violence. Many nobles faced with overwhelming military force opted to negotiate for survival rather than fight. Some provided supplies, others offered hostages, a few even served as guides in exchange for protection. These accommodations were not always treasonous in intent. Many were desperate attempts to shield families or preserve territories. But collectively, they had a corrosive effect. The chronicle occasionally laments the unsteadfastness of both nobles and commoners, revealing deep anxiety over shifting loyalties. The church faced similar dilemmas. Monasteries had been early targets, but not all Viking leaders were indiscriminate. Some recognized the economic and political value of allowing ecclesiastical communities to function. As a result, bishops and abbots sometimes negotiated with invaders to secure the safety of their people or their sacred objects. These actions, while pragmatic, further eroded the idea of a unified Christian resistance. Refugees arriving in Wessex recounted not only military defeats but also personal betrayals, neighbors who aligned with Viking forces, local leaders who capitulated too quickly, communities divided over whether to resist or comply. Families found themselves torn apart. A father might choose defiance while his eldest son, seeking to avoid starvation or enslavement, joined a Viking warband. By the time Wessex became the final independent kingdom, it was a realm burdened not only by external threat, but by internal mistrust. And it was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that Alfred would assume the crown. Alfred's ascent to the throne was shaped by tragedy. The youngest son of King Ethelwulf, he was not expected to rule. His education emphasized piety, scholarship, and diplomacy. He traveled widely, gaining exposure to the broader Christian world. His reputation among contemporaries was one of intelligence and moral seriousness rather than military leadership. But fate redirected his path. His elder brothers died in rapid succession, some in battle against the Vikings, others from illness. By 871, Alfred became king of Wessex, a kingdom already exhausted by conflict. The chronicle refers to that year as a time of heavy tribulation, noting 9 significant battles fought against the invading army. Alfred won several engagements, but none produced lasting security. Each victory was followed by new incursions. His forces were depleted. His nobles debated openly whether resistance was sustainable. Some argued that Wessex should follow Marshes' example and negotiate terms. Others insisted that surrender would mean enslavement or death. Alfred attempted to hold the kingdom together through both military action and diplomacy, but pressure mounted with every passing season. When Guthrum emerged as the primary leader of the Viking forces in the region, the threat to Wessex intensified. By the late 870s, Alfred's kingdom was cornered, and the decisive blow was about to fall. In January 878, Guthrum launched a winter assault, an unexpected and devastating move. Winter campaigns were rare in early medieval warfare. Most armies disbanded seasonally, allowing men to tend to their families and farms. But Viking forces, accustomed to harsher climates and driven by strategic opportunity, exploited this assumption. The chronicle recounts, in midwinter, the army stole to Chippenham. Alfred narrowly escaped with a small group of loyal retainers. His royal household dissolved. Viking forces seized key strongholds. Panic spread across Wessex. Alfred retreated into the marshlands of Somerset, a landscape of bogs, wooded islets, and shifting waterways. There he lived in obscurity, relying on local peasants for shelter and food. His situation was desperate. Many subjects believed he was dead. Others, uncertain of his status, hesitated to act. Chroniclers describe this period as one of profound hardship. Alfred had little ability to command armies or issue decrees, yet he used this time to reassess Wessex's weaknesses and strategize for the future. He sent trusted messengers to identify which nobles remained loyal and which territories could still support resistance. This period of exile, though bleak, served as a turning point. Alfred's survival kept alive the possibility of renewed leadership, but he would have to rebuild his kingdom from the margins with no guarantee of success. Alfred's months in the Marshes were spent not only in hiding, but in reflection. He recognized that traditional Anglo-Saxon military structures could not withstand sustained invasion. The feared, local militias summoned temporarily, was too slow, too inconsistent, and too dependent on agricultural cycles. England needed a permanent defensive infrastructure. From these insights emerged a vision that would transform Wessex. Alfred planned a network of fortified towns known as burhs, each strategically located to defend major routes, supply lines, and population centers. These were not simple fortresses. They were administrative and economic hubs that could support garrisons and provide refuge in times of crisis. Alfred also sought to reform military service. Instead of mobilizing entire regions simultaneously, he devised a rotational system. One group of men served in the field while another maintained farms and households, ensuring that forces remained available year-round without collapsing the economy. Naval innovation was another priority. Recognizing the Vikings' mastery of riverine and coastal warfare, Alfred explored designs for ships that could challenge them. Although his early naval efforts were modest, they marked the beginning of an English naval tradition. Equally significant was the rebuilding of political trust. Alfred reached out to nobles with patience and humility, emphasizing collective survival rather than royal authority. His perseverance during exile and his willingness to listen restored confidence among those who had doubted him. By spring 878, Alfred had rallied enough support to confront Guthrum. His emergence from the Marshes signaled a rebirth of Wessex's resistance. The confrontation at Edington marked a decisive moment in the struggle between Wessex and the Great Heathen Army. Alfred's forces, composed of local levies and loyal nobles, gathered with renewed determination. Many had suffered personal losses. Their villages had been burned, their families threatened. Their motivation was as much emotional as strategic. The battle was fierce. Early medieval combat relied heavily on shield walls, dense formations where shields interlocked and spears thrust forward. The chronicle describes the fight as long and fierce, indicating an engagement that tested the endurance of both sides. Alfred's reforms, though still in early stages, contributed to improved discipline and cohesion. His forces gradually pushed the Viking line back. When Guthrum's army retreated to its stronghold, Alfred surrounded it, cutting off access to food and reinforcements. After a period of siege, Guthrum sought peace. This was a remarkable development. The leader of a force that had defeated multiple kingdoms now stood before Alfred, the king he had driven into exile. The victory at Edington did not end the Viking presence in England, but it halted their immediate expansion and allowed Wessex to regroup. The aftermath of Edington led to a negotiated settlement. Guthrum and several of his closest followers were baptized, with Alfred serving as sponsor. This act established a symbolic alliance and provided a framework for future cooperation. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum divided England into spheres of influence. Wessex and western Mercia remained under Saxon control. The north and east became the Danelaw, where Scandinavian customs and legal traditions shaped governance. This was not territorial surrender, but pragmatic recognition of a changed political landscape. Scandinavian settlement in the Danelaw transformed the region. Place names of Norse origin proliferated. Archaeological evidence shows hybrid building styles, tool types, and agricultural practices. Trade routes connected English towns to Scandinavian markets, creating economic networks that extended far beyond the island. Meanwhile, Alfred focused on internal consolidation. He built burhs, issued legal reforms rooted in both Christian ethics and practical governance, and promoted learning as a foundation of stable rule. He believed that ignorance weakened societies, making them vulnerable to external threats. Although the island remained politically divided, cultural integration accelerated. Intermarriage became common. Children grew up speaking a mix of Old English and Old Norse. Everyday vocabulary absorbed Scandinavian words, reflecting close interaction in markets, farms, and towns. By the late 9th century, England was no longer the land it had been at the start of the Viking Age. It was evolving into a hybrid society shaped by two peoples whose initial encounters had been marked by violence. After Alfred's death in 899, his successors continued the effort to unify England. His son Edward the Elder expanded the burh system and reclaimed territories along the borders of the Danelaw. His daughter, Ethelfled, known as the Lady of the Mercians, played a crucial role in securing Mercia and leading campaigns that regained key strategic towns. As the English frontier advanced, cultural fusion deepened. Norse settlers adopted Christianity, English agricultural techniques, and elements of Saxon legal culture. Saxons in turn incorporated Norse vocabulary, weapon types, and traditions. The influence of Norse words on English, especially everyday terms like sky, window, law, wrong, take, and give, demonstrates how thoroughly the cultures blended. Meanwhile, Scandinavian rulers continued to hold power in the north, especially in York. Figures like Ragnall, Sihtric, and Olaf established courts, minted coins, and negotiated alliances with English kings. These interactions shaped political developments for decades. By the mid-10th century, Alfred's lineage had achieved what had once seemed impossible: the unification of most of England under a single crown. But this new kingdom was not purely Anglo-Saxon. It carried unmistakable Scandinavian influence in its language, laws, and cultural identity. The Vikings had come as conquerors. Over time, they became settlers, neighbors, and contributors to the emerging English nation. Their presence reshaped the island's political structures, economic networks, and social fabric. England was not forged solely by victory or ethnic continuity. It emerged from conflict, adaptation, and cultural fusion, from the intermingling of peoples who had once faced each other across shield walls. The war that began with fire and terror ultimately produced a kingdom stronger, more diverse, and more complex than any of its early inhabitants could have imagined. This is the true story of how England was born. Thanks for watching. Click subscribe and dive into this playlist next. More untold stories of empires, warriors, and history-changing battles are just a click away.